Good evening, you guys. This is chapter 21 of Engineering Eden by Jordan Fisher Smith. By 1970, Harry Walker had become a familiar face at the Smokehouse, a brick-fronted billiards hall with front windows looking out on the main business street of Anniston, half a block from the white marble courthouse where Assistant U.S. Attorney Spivak later took depositions from the Alabama witnesses. He was a grown man now, 23, 6'1", long and lean, all muscle and gristle, with a ready smile that showed his big, even, white teeth. He dressed in blue jeans, tight white t-shirts that his mother kept bleached, and plaid shirts. He liked to shoot pool, but the Smokehouse was also part of a whole mosaic of side jobs he cobbled together for extra income. Although he worked long hours at his father's farm, the dairy didn't clear enough to pay him a full salary. So in addition to the Smokehouse, at various times Harry worked the night shift at a pipe foundry, spent a couple of weeks on an oil rig off the Gulf Coast, and crewed on a shrimp boat out of Mobile. Based on his experience with farm machines, the National Guard trained him as a heavy equipment operator, and he brokered this skill into yet another job running a backhoe for an Anniston construction company. When the mail carrier on the Walker's rural route was looking for a substitute for vacations and sick days, he asked Harry. Harry applied and got that job too. Harry's life was laid out before him. Like the cows that had worn their habitual trails in the red clay from the lower pasture to the milking barn, Harry would mark the hours of his life treading the same paths his daddy did, and at least for now, he would have to work those other jobs as well. At Yellowstone in the spring of 1970, a newly promoted 30-year-old sub-district ranger was sent down from Mammoth Hot Springs to take over day-to-day operations at Old Faithful Village. Jim Brady was not a big man, but he had played college football, and he exuded physical confidence. His manner was thoughtful, polite, and deferential. He had a way of making people feel like they had his total attention when they talked with him, and among his subordinates, he had a reputation for being preternaturally cool in emergencies. Brady had grown up in San Bernardino, where the smog drifting east from Los Angeles met the dust and tumbleweeds of the Mojave Desert. His father was a brakeman for the Santa Fe Railroad there, and when Brady was 14, his old man was hit by a train and put out of work. As the family slipped into poverty, Brady discovered football, which earned him an athletic scholarship to Humboldt State University in the coastal rainforests of Northern California. In addition to lumber mills and muddy scrimmages, Humboldt was known for turning out foresters and wildlife biologists. Brady majored in botany and zoology and married his high school sweetheart. By the time he graduated, in 1962, he was working as a seasonal park ranger and very much wanted to be a permanent one. That summer, his wife gave birth to their first child at Yellowstone National Park. Brady's specialty within the Park Service, as opposed to a scientist such as Glenn Cole or a ranger naturalist like Lloyd Parrott, whose job was to give out information to visitors and teach people about nature, was to make sure the coming and going of millions of visitors went smoothly and to see to it that they went home in one piece. In the early 1960s, when Brady came on the scene, the Park Service was diversifying its traditional fare of awe-inspiring scenery with new parks, where the emphasis was on pure outdoor recreation. Brady got his first permanent job in 1963 at one of these, Lake Mead, the reservoir formed by Hoover Dam on the Colorado River. Just outside of Las Vegas, Lake Mead National Recreation Area was a 24-hour bacchanal of alcohol, high-powered boats, firearms, and other assorted weapons. It was a gladiator school for young law enforcement rangers. By the time he transferred back to Yellowstone in November of 1967, Brady had been shot at 3 times. About the first thing they found for him to do when he got back to Yellowstone was fly around the Lamar Valley as an observer in a helicopter, chasing elk through snow into winged fences and corrals that by then were referred to, not so affectionately, as McGee traps. After the beating the Park Service had taken in Senator McGee's hearings that March, they weren't shooting any elk, and as Glenn Cole implemented natural control, it was the last time they would give them away. 984 of them that winter. From the helicopter, beneath a ceiling of snow clouds, the Lamar Valley was a study in blue, gray, and black, and orange, where a shaft of low sun stole under the weather to light a distant peak. It had been snowing, and the icy wind had blown the powder off the ridges and into the gullies and low spots, where it settled in hundreds of parallel paths generations of elk had engraved into the mountainsides in their desperate search for sustenance. The elk trails stood out as white lines across the stony slopes, like contours of a topographic map. The helicopter shook as the pilot swooped back and forth, herding strings of elk through the deep snow in the gullies. After the mayhem in Las Vegas, for Brady this was like coming home. And from the tiny bubble-canopied craft, the immensity of the valley and the white elk paths were beautiful, and it all looked convincingly like wilderness. Brady made a good account of himself in 1968 and 1969 in the North District and Mammoth Hot Springs, and in 1970, he was made the Old Faithful Sub-District Ranger. Old Faithful Village is located along the Grand Loop Road in the valley of the Firehole River, in the western part of Yellowstone. The meadows surrounding it are bounded on the east by the timbered ridge of Observation Point, and on the west by the dark lava bluffs at the eastern edge of the Madison Plateau. In those days, the village contained some 400 buildings, the greater number of them tiny brown painted guest cabins and other small structures. The ruling presences were the two large historic hotels on the north end, facing a semicircular plank causeway around an aperture from which, at intervals of just over an hour, the Old Faithful geyser erupted over 100 feet in the air. Beyond the geyser, paths and boardwalks extended north into Upper Geyser Basin and up the rounded white slope of Geyser Hill. The hill and the valley in the distance were dotted with clouds of steam rising from geysers and hot pools. The Grand Loop Road had been constructed by Army engineers in the early days as a dirt wagon track. By 1970, it was a 142-mile strip of asphalt, 22 feet wide, connecting Old Faithful to the other clusters of hotels and cabins, stores, cafes, visitor centers, marinas, and campgrounds in the park. These features constituted less than 5% of Yellowstone's total area, but absorbed over 95% of the ranger's energy. A project to divert the road around Old Faithful Village was completed for the centennial summer of 1972. But when Jim Brady took over in 1970, on an average summer day, between 11 in the morning and 3 in the afternoon, from 600 to 800 cars, trucks, buses, and motorhomes rolled right through the village. At intervals of about 65 minutes, when the geyser went off, drivers of passing cars would stop in the middle of the road. Everyone would pile out with their cameras, and the Grand Loop would become gridlocked in both directions. There was no getting a patrol car or an ambulance through, and as one of his first administrative actions, Brady put in a request for a motorcycle. Vehicle fires, forest fires, lost children and pets, fistfights over parking places or other imagined slights, spousal disputes, thefts, and the delivery of emergency messages to call home about the death of an aunt were all part of the job. Brady's life was a strange juxtaposition of quiet, sage-scented moments watching elk and bison grazing slowly across the meadows, and other moments that embodied the whole intense pageant of human existence, from birth to sudden death. In June of 1970, he found himself stepping gingerly toward the edge of a pool of boiling hot water in the Upper Geyser Basin with a rope around his waist, held by another ranger, and carrying a bucket of strong soap. A 9-year-old boy walking through the geysers with his family had stumbled off the boardwalk and fallen into the pool. His mother and father heard the splash and turned around to see him surface with a shocked expression, then sink and die. He was boiled until the meat fell off his bones. It had been known since the turn of the century, when it was done for the entertainment of tourists, that soaping the hot springs caused them to bubble more violently. This action caused what was left of the boy to rise to the surface, where Brady and his rangers skimmed about 8 pounds of the remains for burial. With all of that, the second stage of Anderson and Cole's closure plan made things twice as bad at Old Faithful that year. The bears displaced by food reductions at Trout Creek awoke that spring to find workers bulldozing dirt over Rabbit Creek and installing an electrified fence around a temporary landfill at Nez Perce Creek, a couple of miles north. There were no power lines there, so a generator ran 24 hours a day, and a maintenance worker was assigned to monitor it. Alone, out there at night, he witnessed huge grizzlies getting sparked off the fence and, as Brady understood it, was so unnerved by the experience that he refused to go back. Meanwhile, in a cooperative effort with the state of Montana to keep grizzlies off garbage along Yellowstone's boundaries, the town dump at West Yellowstone was closed that summer. However, as Steven Zetterberg forced Starker Leopold to admit during his cross-examination, bears did not respond suddenly switching to an all-natural diet. June of 1970 was exactly 2 months long, Brady remembered. Brady and his rangers spent their days dealing with people and their nights dealing with grizzlies. Scattered in the pines on the south side of the village was the housing for Park Service and concession employees. At night, grizzlies wandered the unlit gravel roads there, past the dormitories, houses, and trailers, looking for something to eat. So Brady and his rangers were setting covert traps, tranquilizing the bears, and relocating them. Toward the 4th of July weekend in 1970, a trap was set in front of Brady's trailer. One night, he was awakened by the sound of the steel gate clanging shut. Luckily, his wife and 3 little girls were up at Mammoth Hot Springs at the time. It was about 2 in the morning. He got up and looked out the front window to where the porch light cast a pool of light around the trap. Sure enough, it was sprung. Grizzlies mate between May and July, and Brady knew that around that time, if you trapped a female, there might be a male nearby. He got on the phone and woke up Mike Warren, a bear management ranger, and asked him to get in his patrol car and drive through the housing area to see if there were any other grizzlies around. Warren drove around, spotlighting the woods for about 15 minutes, then radioed an all clear and pulled up in front of Brady's trailer. Brady came out to meet him, leaving the trailer door ajar as the screen door sprung shut. The 2 of them peered into the trap and saw a sow they'd handled before. Suddenly, Warren said, "Run!" Both men sprinted for the safety of the trailer, dove underneath the porch railing, and tumbled right through the closed screen door, demolishing it. Brady slammed the trailer door behind them as a big male bear attacked the porch in frustration, and then went over to the trap with the female inside and started banging on it with its paws. Brady got out a dart pistol, sat down at the kitchen table, and loaded a dart with enough Sacostrin to put down a big bear or instantly kill a human being. His hands were shaking with adrenaline. As he finished loading the pistol, he accidentally discharged it. The dart missed Warren and lodged in the ceiling. Brady loaded another, walked over to the door, cracked it open, and darted the big male with the first shot. The bear ran off into the darkness. Brady and Warren got into Warren's car and drove around the housing area looking for the bear. Time went by, long enough for the animal to have been immobilized and then come to again. Finally, they saw a light on in a small travel trailer and heard a woman screaming. The bear was up against the side of the trailer, trying to turn it over. Brady darted it again. This time it went straight down. The 2 rangers went back to anesthetize the trapped female bear and towed the trap containing her over to the second bear. They woke up a couple of other rangers and tried to drag the big male into the trap, but he was too heavy. So they went to get a pickup with an electric winch, snaked the cable through the trap past the sow, winched the male in next to her, and slammed the gate. The 6-year-old male had been transplanted twice before and was sent to a zoo. Brady isn't sure what happened to the sow. That was how it was at Old Faithful in the summer of 1970. Anderson and Cole had ordered dump closure to proceed, and Brady was determined to make it through the year without a serious bear incident at Old Faithful. He almost did. Or maybe he actually did. We may never know, because amid the daily chaos and all the good deeds of the Rangers that summer, key evidence thought to be fragmentary human remains was mishandled and lost. And although Jim Brady could not have known it, the old grizzly that would later kill Harry Walker passed through his hands. Frank Craighead learned about the macabre discovery along the Firehole River near Old Faithful over a month before it happened, when in the fall of 1970, he struck up a conversation at a store in West Yellowstone with a young man who turned out to be an off-duty seasonal ranger. "Would you tell the court the conversation you had with Ranger Schroeder at that time?" Zetterberg asked Craighead on the witness stand. "Well, the first time was the evening of October 10, 1970, when I inadvertently started talking with Gerald B. Schroeder, seasonal ranger," responded Craighead. "I didn't realize that he had more than average knowledge of the situation in Yellowstone, so I asked him who he was, and he told me. Through him, I first learned of a possible mortality in the camp along Firehole River." At that point in the conversation, Frank testified, he removed a notebook from the breast pocket of his shirt and began taking notes as Schroeder continued his tale. He said that in the Old Faithful area in 1970, there was probably or possibly another human mortality, but this had not been recorded and not been released to the public. Schroeder had told Craighead that an abandoned camp had been located, apparently torn up by a bear. Cans found that were mouthed and squashed, but not punctured, said Frank. Sleeping gear had been dragged a considerable distance away from the camp, and a tuft of human hair had been found. There were indications that possibly a human had been killed at this camp, but no other evidence was apparently found. The camper never showed up, and the camp was removed by the Rangers, Frank testified. Not long after that, he told the court, an old bear with broken teeth had been trapped at Old Faithful and flown 18 miles into the backcountry. Certainly a bear moved only 18 miles away. In my experience, transplanting them and tracking them by radio would readily come back. So there is a good possibility that the bear that disturbed this camp could also have been the bear that was in the Walker Boys camp, Craighead concluded. In the courtroom, Assistant U.S. Attorney Spivak was a slow, methodical sort of man, given to staring abstractedly into space when he was formulating his questions. His suits were of a good quality, but worn and out of date. He transported his reams of case folders from his office on the courthouse's top floor to the courtroom in a shopping cart. On the afternoon of February 19, 1975, he led Jim Brady through a plodding recital of the geography of Old Faithful, asking the ranger to point out, on an aerial photo, locations pertinent to the events leading up to the death of Harry Walker. On the morning of February 20th, Brady took the stand again for cross-examination by Zetterberg, who wanted to talk about this possible mortality that Frank Craighead had brought up. Brady wore his olive wool dress uniform, a gray shirt with epaulets, green tie, gold badge, tie tack, and nameplate. His wide-open, almost startled-looking, piercing blue eyes contrasted with his habitually deadpan, poker-faced expression. Zetterberg showed Brady a page from the log kept next to the two-way radio at the front desk of the Old Faithful Ranger Station. In a column on the left side were the times of various events in 24-hour military notation. To the right of them were handwritten notes about what had happened. Zetterberg directed Brady's attention to an entry made at 16:51 hours, or 4:51 p.m., on August 23rd, 1970. Now it says here, 16:51, 23 August 1970, David Hamilton, OFL. What is that? He asked Brady, pointing to the initials. Old Faithful log, apparently, responded the ranger. Old Faithful, Zetterberg agreed and continued. It reports, the visitors at the Upper Firehole Bridge are gazing. Here Zetterberg paused theatrically, as if trying to make out the entry, which he knew very well. And it looks like are gazing at a scalp on a blanket. The human scalp is an upholstery stretched thin over its bony substrate, and it was not unknown for it to be peeled off in a big flap during a grizzly attack. So the report that had come in about a scalp was a plausible one, and one of Jim Brady's rangers and a seasonal firefighter were dispatched to investigate. Arriving at 5:36 p.m. near a bridge where the Grand Loop Road crossed the fire hole, the rangers radioed that indeed there was a blanket on which lay a scalp with pieces of flesh crawling with maggots. They collected the blanket and remains and brought them back to the ranger station. Stephen Zetterberg called the judge's attention to an entry made in the logbook by a ranger named Stu Orgill at the time the evidence reached the ranger station. Your Honor, may I point out that at 17:36, a person that might or might not have been Stu Orgill wrote in the log, quote, regarding 16:51, it is a scalp with pieces of flesh, maggots, pictures taken and pieces collected under the rear of the building, end quote. Storing flesh or any remnant of a body that was not completely dry in a plastic bag at ambient summer temperatures outdoors under the back of a ranger station was not something a properly trained policeman or evidence technician would have done. Without freezing or refrigeration, the moist environment of a plastic bag speeds putrefaction and decomposition, but the rangers probably considered the material too objectionable to bring inside. Today, collection and preservation of evidence is taught at the National Park Service's Basic Law Enforcement Academy. However, for rangers in 1970, there was no academy. They learned on the job, as Brady had at Lake Mead, and even as many policemen and sheriff's deputies did outside the national parks at that time. On August 24th, 1970, the day after the scalp was found, 8 or 9 rangers and firefighters, supervised by Jim Brady's boss, the West District Ranger, went back to the scene and made an intensive search of the area. Another clump of hair of either human or animal origin was located and brought to the ranger station. Jim Brady remembered looking at the blanket and other material and directing a ranger to drive them to the law enforcement office at park headquarters in Mammoth Hot Springs. After the evidence arrived there on August 31st, 8 days after the initial find, it was mailed from the law enforcement office to an FBI crime lab. But when it got there, an inventory by the laboratory technician of the items in the package did not include a scalp. And the records of the FBI showed that what was sent was the blanket, said Zetterberg, connecting the dots for the judge. And the report from the blanket refers to hair taken from the blanket. There is no reference to the scalp. Now, where is the scalp? Is that a question for me? Asked Brady from the witness stand. That's right, said Zetterberg pointedly. Well, Mr. Zetterberg, I would think... I don't want your philosophy, Mr. Brady, said Zetterberg sharply. I want to know if you know where that scalp is. Let's let him answer, said Judge Houck. He's trying to answer. I believe it is in Mammoth, said Brady. On what basis do you base that belief? Zetterberg pressed him. Brady explained that the law enforcement office was the central repository for all evidence. Anything sent to the FBI would have been sent from there, and if it was returned by the FBI after analysis, it would be retained there. Wait just a moment, said Zetterberg. You said it was sent to the FBI, but the report there does not say it was sent to the FBI. The report says, quote, blanket Q1 sent to FBI, unquote. And there is no reference to any maggots, and there is no reference to a scalp. And you have got a week in between. And what can maggots do to a scalp in a week? I see, said Brady. Well, to the best of my knowledge, Mr. Zetterberg, the blanket and the scalp, which were kind of stuck together, were sent. To Mammoth? Asked Zetterberg. Correct, answered Brady. From you? And that's the last you knew of it? Yes, sir, as far as I recall. About 3 weeks after the discovery of the blanket with the scalp, a park visitor reported finding an abandoned camp in the same area. Ranger Tom Cherry was dispatched to investigate. Upon arrival, he and his partner found the camp's furnishings torn up and strewn around. In contrast to the account that Frank Craighead had gotten from Gerald Schroeder, Cherry maintained that cans of food at the camp had been punctured by bear's teeth as opposed to mashed without holes. The Rangers cataloged 17 items of personal property and searched the area. No sign of the camp's occupant was found. In the following weeks, Cherry attempted to match the abandoned camp with missing persons reports, but nothing came of it. If someone was dragged out of camp and eaten by a bear along the Firehole River in August of 1970, no other part of him or her has ever been found.